Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall Podcast with Kate Riga. We have a bunch of things we're going to talk about today, mainly domestic politics. But before that, I want to discuss briefly this really kind of surreal thing that happened in Russia over the weekend with this mutiny. This I don't know whether to I kind of don't know whether to say Wagner or Wagner. Since it's Russian, and I guess I don't know if they default to the German pronunciation or whatever. But in any case, a pretty wild stuff, and I've done a few posts about it, so I just wanted to flag it. Uh, but it's really quite shocking. But there's a history of this as well. It's one of the things that happens when countries get involved in major military involvements. Uh, Sometimes it ends up blowing back into their own state. Right? There's lots of examples of this in history, and you could even say at a very limited level, it happened in the United States during the Vietnam War. You had a sort of a rolling domestic crisis from the late 1960s through the early 1970s. Some people even kind of class the Watergate scandal and Nixon's resignation as part of that general crisis. Although by the time that Nixon resigned, or even by the time of Watergate, the U.S. had significantly um, had significant. They called it Vietnamization, right? Had significantly sort of reduced U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And in any case, for all the domestic tumult that happened in the late 1960s and 1970, 1971, 1972, nothing like this. We didn't have any like general, fly a few brigades back to the United States and like march on Washington or something like that. But the interesting thing is that there is a very big history of this actually in Russia. In 1905, after the Russians had a very bad experience in a war with Japan, they had a uh, basically they switched to somewhat a constitutional monarchy. The monarchy had to give way on some of its absolutism, and then it was World War I that basically drove the collapse of the Russian state, the Russian imperial state, which uh, gave way to the USSR. You can make a decent argument, some argument, that it was the the Soviet entanglement in Afghanistan that helped not maybe cause, but at least be the trigger of the collapse of the Soviet Union. In any case, um, both of these sides. If you were watching this in real time, it was very strange because it started almost as a joke. Like this guy says he's going to go to Moscow, and it's like people were wondering, is he even serious? And then suddenly it seemed very serious, and at least internationally, there was some question of like, is this actually happening? Is this a coup attempt that may work? And then suddenly it was all called off, like just as it was happening, right? Like the whole thing lasted less than a day. Um, and I think the general consensus is that it unfolded in a way that neither side really expected, and that both sides had no way of really knowing what was going to come next. And so both had paradoxically a common interest in saying, let's step back. Let's draw back here and not roll this, roll these dice the way we seem to be doing. And since then, Vladimir Putin has been trying to kind of puff up his chest and you know, uh, congratulate and reward the heroes who put down the coup, the mutiny, while at the same time the people who did it are are getting a pass. So it's a very weird, and I think continues to be unstable and not done situation over in Russia, and obviously that has tremendous implications for the ongoing war in Ukraine, which the U.S. is deeply involved with, although not a combatant. So just keep an eye. That doesn't seem to be over if you haven't been watching it closely. Then on the domestic side, we're going to talk about the Supreme Court cases. I actually just did a post about this morning because many people, and I'm one of them, is endlessly critical of the corruption of this court, the sort of ideological corruption, in addition to a lot of venal corruption that we've seen later. And yet, kind of out of the blue, you keep having these, like, quote unquote surprise decisions where it's like, wow, we thought this terrible thing was going to happen, and it's totally the reverse. And so, what's going on? I mean, we'll talk about that. My general theory is that I think that two or three key members of the court have decided that they may have taken things a bit too far, and a bit too far where their continued power is in danger. Maybe not in this year or 2024, but if you are a Brent Kavanaugh or Amy Barrett, you're thinking you're going to be there for 20, 30 years. So these things are important. So that's my general sense. Kate and I we're gonna get into that. And then we're also going to talk about this Trump tape, which I'm sure you've heard about, and some ongoing Freedom Caucus drama, which you may or may not have heard about. Before that, we are still in our drive month, so our sponsor continues to be, for this episode, TPM, the company that puts on this podcast. We're just finishing the third week of the TPM Journalism Fund Drive for this year. We have a pretty ambitious and pretty necessary target goal this year. We are coming up on 80% of the way there, but we're in the final lap, so we need to actually get all the way there. It's really important. So if you're a reader of TPM, if you go to the website a lot, you've heard me talking about it. You've seen all the promos on the site. If you've been putting it off, please make today the day that you contribute. If you're game, if you're just a listener to the podcast and you don't know that much about TPM, first of all, I hope you consider becoming a member because it supports what we do on this podcast. But more generally, we've got a lot of good stuff over on the site, right? You hear Kate talking. She's got a lot of great articles. You're going to want to read those too, all the things that she's reporting on, and all our other reporters, and so on and so forth. But again, this drive is really important. So if you're just a listener to the podcast, consider contributing. If you're game, you can go to talkingpointsmemo.com, and I could tell you specifically where to go, but if you just like make contact with the site, you're going to see promos and stuff like that, and it'll tell you where to sign up and all of that. So anyway, Kate, what's up? What are we talking about?
So we'll start with the big Supreme Court decision that came down yesterday. And it's funny because it's one that we were awaiting, was on kind of our short list of what we're watching here as we come to the end of the term, but we didn't actually know if we'd get an opinion on it. And that's Moore versus Harper, which is the independent state legislature theory case. There had been quite a delay since the court last asked for supplemental briefing. So it was pretty clear that someone was writing. But a theory from a lot of people I talked to was that um, most people thought this case would be mooted for jurisdictional reasons because the underlying case um, has been overturned, and the whole hullabaloo there. So everyone kind of thought that it would probably be a dismissal of the case and then like someone was writing a dissent to that, and that's probably what the gap was. But we got a full-throated decision yesterday where the majority pretty squarely rejected the independent state legislature theory, which, as a reminder, is a super literal reading of two clauses of the Constitution um, to to conclude that state legislatures, to the exclusion of state courts, state constitutions, governor's veto, that just the legislators get to administer federal elections. And that's, passing election laws, controlling redistricting processes, voting laws, all that kind of stuff. So
And just to be clear, that a dismissal in this case, because the underlying question sort of became moot, that they could just say, they could dismiss it and not have to say anything and not have to really judge anything. Like, oh, okay, nothing's, and so that's the difference you're talking about, as opposed to a full
exactly.
decision to decide the underlying issues.
Right. And it's still kind of consensus. Like, people are weirded out that they issued an opinion on this case because the jurisdictional stuff seemed pretty straightforward, that there's no live case or controversy for them uh, to respond to at this point. And that's what Thomas dissented. And the first third of his dissent is all about that jurisdictional stuff. Like, this is mooted. It's not proper for a court to write an opinion on a case like this. And he was joined by Alito and Gorsuch. And then only in the kind of last part does he get into his meritsy stuff. But so basically, the conclusion from everyone who's watching this is like, well, that's really weird that they did an opinion on it. However, good outcome. They rejected this really radical right-wing theory that sought to put all the power of administering elections and, getting together the elector slates and all that stuff, sought to put it in the hands of state legislatures, which, not coincidentally, in many red and even purple states, Republicans have gerrymandered themselves into like huge dominant control. And that made a lot of people nervous that the court was going to accept the theory. And then state legislatures would be totally empowered to kind of make a slate of fake electors should Trump lose in 2024. So they rejected it pretty resoundingly. Barrett and Kavanaugh joined Roberts and the liberals. So a 6-3 decision. And in the immediate aftermath, if you've been following this, you might see like the super terminally online lawyer contingent of Twitter that have all kind of made a career from themselves for their constant tweeting. They've been like kind of fighting amongst each other about how good this decision is, because there's a contingent of people who say there's some like hedging in the majority about when federal courts should get involved in these kind of state level election disputes. Like, when have state courts gone too far afield of normal judicial review that it would trigger kind of a federal court intervention? That was a big kind of wonky like back and forth, where you can kind of see the pull from the right-wing judges who are part of the majority in wanting to leave that door open. And basically everyone's like, okay, well, this is them not taking off the table a future Bush v. Gore, right? A future situation where the court could kind of intervene and take over in a case like this. And so you have some experts being like, this is bad. We're going to see more Bush v. Gores in the future, blah, 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 which is like, my response to that is okay, but that was the status quo before this decision. / did we expect this court, which has like 3 people who were actively involved in the Bush v. Gore litigation, to close the door to a future one? Like, you got to be a little realistic here.
Well, it's also how, I'm not even sure how they would precisely, since, I mean, especially because Bush v. Gore was presented sort of ridiculously as like, this doesn't have anything to do with anything, so it's just time out, like we're just going to come in and do this. So, but I mean, how would they have had a decision that would just be like, we're not going to do weird stuff on elections or kind of like decide them anymore, just letting you know? I mean, how, I didn't even understand how that would.
Yeah, they would have to have handed something down like, this is the exclusive jurisdiction of state courts. This isn't for federal courts to decide. But like,
But even that, no one believes that there's
yeah, it's
that
silly.
things can't get so crazy that federal courts would well, let me ask you this. Is there a consensus or even theories on why they did issue a decision, if not only did they not have to, but maybe it wasn't even necessarily appropriate to, since there was no issue before them?
Honestly, I think the biggest concern was that if they had said, like, this is moot, we're not deciding it now, almost 100% would states do a mid 2024 litigation, would put forward this theory again and kind of force their hand to decide it. So my best guess is that they were aware of the utter chaos that would come. So I guess of the two evils, they thought maybe issuing an opinion on a case that is not technically live now is better than waiting till we're in like the firestorm of the days after the election. Which is interesting because that was kind of the primary argument in a bunch of these supplemental briefs in terms of the court kept being like, should we decide this now or no? Like, how do we act now that the underlying case has gotten so weird? And most people said, you don't have jurisdiction, don't decide this. But there was a coterie of people, and not just right wing people, like Common Cause, kind of good government groups, who were like, this is going to keep coming up, would rather have the decision now than in the 2024 kind of flurry, which has provoked its own internecine fight with the terminally online lawyer Twitter sect because Neil Cat, how do you say it? Cat y'all?
Oh,
You
cat
know,
yell. I'm not.
okay.
That's how I say
Neil,
it, but I don't know if that's
I'm
right.
just gonna commit. So Neil Katyal is getting like all these accolades because he did oral arguments for the anti-independent state legislature side, but now uh, I guess, is like squabbling with Mark Elias, the other big election lawyer guy, because Neil is like, everyone said that they didn't have jurisdiction, like we stood alone and that's how we got this good decision and blah blah blah, like the DOJ didn't have the guts, whatever. And it's kind of like, that's such a wild position to take because you can only take that victory lap if the Supreme Court rules in your favor, which we didn't know they were going to do. Like, I don't think people were being kind of like wimps by saying, let's maybe take this grenade out of the hands of the court, you
Right,
know?
right. I mean, it seems to me that that explanation is the logical one, that for a number of reasons, and I think this kind of coincides with my sort of broader theory, um, or the theory I subscribe to. It's not uniquely my theory, that they just said we got to put this to bed. Like, this is nuts, and like we're gonna say no. This is, we're not even, we're just putting this to bed. And because I did a post about this morning, saying that I do think that there's a number of justices who kind of say this backlash is serious. We're kind of out here a bit on a limb, and we need to, uh, choose our shots, basically. And that's why I think, and you and I talked about this yesterday, I think that they probably will do a pretty bad decision on affirmative action, because that's a core thing in the right wing legal world. They've been, that has been something. What is it? Is it the Vallejo case back in the I may have the name wrong. There's a key. God, I can't remember the. In any case, a key 1970s era decision, which I think is still basically the guiding case law on affirmative action. That was the first case where the court basically said you can't just have quotas. That's not okay. Sort of like hard quotas, basically. They need to be, and I'm just in a general sense, it can't be the only criteria. They can't be, that numerical, blah, 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 blah. They've been at this for half a century, in the same way that they were on abortion, in the same way that the court has long been, in many ways, going back to the Lochner era, been wanted to rein in the government's ability to regulate commercial life. But that they, on this kind of like, let's say, gonzo jurisprudence, where it's like whatever some rando down in Texas comes up with on a lark, maybe we're not going to keep, agreeing to hear those cases and affirm those, because that's whacked, and we need to focus on the things that are really important to us, and not just doing a lot of stuff that is nuts and is losing us credibility. I mean, paradoxically, clearly the thing that has really brought this to the fore is the Dobbs decision, for all the obvious reasons. I mean, the paradox is that those are not new theories, and they're not even entirely controversial theories in this sense. And listen to what I'm saying here. I'm not saying on the substance of abortion rights, but within the legal world, privacy, right of privacy and stuff, that has been contested ground for a long time. Dobbs is not something they just came up with, obviously, out of the blue. This has been sort of their holy grail forever. But in any case, that makes sense to me, that they just knew they had to kind of put this to bed no matter what, even if it was iffy that they had a live issue to settle.
I've also discussed this before, but you really get the sense that Roberts in particular just like gets kind of mad when he's presented with half-baked ideas. This kind of, the thing of like a right-wing lawyer concocts some kind of idea and then just uses the right-wing pipeline to get it up to the Supreme Court. And I think he does still have a sense of like, this is hallowed ground, don't kind of come here without doing your homework kind of thing. And just the independent state legislature theory, like presentation in this case, was always just so half-assed. And like, you know, for instance, like the whole premise of the idea is that the Constitution is saying the state legislature and the state legislature alone is in charge of administering elections. But then the North Carolina side is like, except governors' vetoes are fine, because Supreme Court precedent is like a little more specific in that area, and they didn't want to run afoul of that. So then you had the justices being like, well, why? How does that make any sense? And, I don't want to give them too much credit, because obviously they have bought some cockamamie right-wing stuff. But like, there is, I think, a sense of pushback when what they're presented with is just kind of transparently stupid and not even really thought through that much.
One thing that this isn't new, and I guess it's kind of obvious, but it hadn't quite clicked to me in this way until I was thinking about it when I was writing something up last night. But if you believe this theory, you have to believe that the authors of every state constitution written since 1787, which includes a lot of state constitutions, right? All of them did not realize what the Constitution actually said. They missed it. The folks writing them in 1790 and 1795 and 1800, they all missed the plain meaning of the Constitution, because otherwise they wouldn't have created these frameworks of election law in the context of the whole thing. It is one of the many ways in which I think what I said in this post was that it has a vague plausibility in grammatical terms. It has no basis in any history, anything about the past, trying to figure out what they meant. Zero. And in its effect, it's simply absurd. The idea that you were going to go in, overrule the state constitutions, and say the whole framework you have of executive and legislative and judicial and all this kind of stuff, no.
Right. And then the state constitutions created the state legislatures, not realizing that then they were cut out of the equation for the body that derives its power from the Constitution.
It is sort of like a Platonic ideal thing, where they are essentially saying, Constitution writers, you think you created the legislature, but actually the legislature existed before and superior to you. It was
Right.
already there with all these powers that you have. It's simply, it's hard to, it's really hard to capture how, just how off the deep end this is. It's the kind of thing that, you always have gadflies who are coming up with ideas and kind of wacky stuff, and you've got these, constitutional sheriff type stuff. They have this idea like, well, sheriffs exist. It's actually quite similar. It's actually quite similar because their idea is sheriffs exist sort of prior to the constitutional order. They are actually in charge within their county. Sheriffs are the law, and like, no, like we don't have to have counties. Counties don't exist. The things that exist in our system are states. States are, can't just be made to disappear. Counties, we don't. It's the whole thing is just absurd. And I know I'm saying the
Yeah.
same thing over and again, but
Well, and
it's
it's
bad.
so, I think the reason why it infuriates kind of the academics and historians so much is because, like, if you isolate lines in the Constitution, I mean, you could kind of make this argument all over the place. It's like the Commerce Clause solely empowers Congress to legislate on commerce, but nobody reads that to say, and thus the president can't veto any commerce related laws. It's just nowhere else is there this theory that, like, one sentence chews away everything else because it's not, like, really caveated. Anyway, the whole thing, it was silly. It was pretty resoundingly rejected. I think that these lawyers who are being like, well, it doesn't avert any problems in the future, is like, yeah, no kidding, guys. Like, I don't think anyone saw this decision and was like, whew, we're saved. The court's never gonna do anything shitty, like, again, so we can just rest easy. um
Although I would say I 100% agree with you, but I think in a more general sense, along with the voting rights redistricting decision, it does suggest at least some hesitation the court has in pushing what has been a pretty anything goes,
mhm.
anything goes that gets the GOP a couple more percentage points. Let's do it kind of thing. There's also this, you're going to know more of the particulars about this, but kind of rattling around the right wing judicial world for the last few years. They've wanted to, basically that apportionment will only be on the basis of citizens as opposed to residents. And not just apportionment, but basically, if I'm remembering this right, so the idea would be Texas gets all of its. I think they still get all of their electoral votes and all of their representatives, but the districts just get um, written basically for the rural places because immigrants tend not to be in rural areas. Obviously, there are lots of immigrants in rural areas, but statistically, they cluster in cities. So these things just things that are foreclosed, outlawed by the plain text of the Constitution. The Constitution is really clear that it says residents. It says the people there. It doesn't matter what they, citizens, legal, not legal, the amount of people. But just another way to kind of lock in Republican dominance. And that was kind of out there, kind of along sort of comparably to this independent legislature thing of just another ridiculous idea that maybe in not too long you're going to have the Supreme Court say, yeah, cool, let's do it. But I think there's some reason to think maybe, okay, a little less openness to that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and so the independent state legislature theory decision came on the heels of two more um surprisingly good Supreme Court decisions, one more so than the other. And that one is basically DHS put out guidelines for their kind of border patrol forces saying, here are the undocumented immigrants we're going to kind of target for, arrest and removal. The idea being there aren't the resources or the manpower to arrest everyone who's crossing into the country illegally. So, let's kind of focus our firepower on, their broad categories, but things like people suspected of terrorism, basically trying to go
Seems like a
after,
reasonable
right, people who are more of
idea.
a risk. And so Texas and Louisiana sued because they said that guidance might, in a downstream way, if DHS is arresting fewer people, which again, that's not what the guideline said. That doesn't say they're arresting fewer people. It's just shifting who they're prioritizing to arrest. But Texas and Louisiana are saying you're going to arrest fewer people. And that means our states are going to incur the costs of detaining more people or providing them with social services or healthcare or what have you. And that's the injury that they claimed to file the lawsuit, which people were freaked out about because that is such an indirect injury. And basically, like every federal government action could have some potential monetary effect somewhere down the line. And if that's enough for standing, then red states are going to sue the federal government for anything that it does. So that one really summarily knocked down in a bit of a surprise because this is a court that has been so hostile to executive branch agencies exercising even power that there's been a lot of precedent that they have, and that's nowhere is that more true than with law enforcement discretion. That's something that courts pretty much always just give agencies wide latitude with because it's so, I mean, how are you going to kind of judge that? That's such a slippery slope. So, kind of resounding win for the Biden administration there.
And what was the vote on that one?
Yeah, so a pretty kind of heavy win. The kind of clean majority is Kavanaugh, Roberts, and the liberals, but then Gorsuch did a concurring opinion that Thomas and Barrett joined, and Barrett wrote a concurrence that Gorsuch joined. So Alito was the only one who kind of flatly dissented there. And his dissent, it was just it's so classic Alito that, he kind of puts his sympathy with the red states here. And he's like, they're already bearing such a burden. And now we're making things even more difficult for them. It's like you would never catch Alito sparing an ounce of sympathy for, the people who are fleeing violence or poverty or whatever.
Well, it's all, beyond the merits of the individual case, you could imagine a different under specific issue in which one might feel, more sympathy with the states, but you basically can't have a federal government if you go down this path. These are inherently political questions. The standard way to look at this is a political question. If it's so bad, send different representatives to Congress to change the law or elect a different president. And I don't know the specific case law and jurisprudence about exactly this question, but the court has generally said either it's totally off limits, it's just nothing, it's not in our purview at all, or it has to be sort of facially absurd or usually, unreasonable reasonability test. And clearly this is not unreasonable. But it's funny because it's certainly true that the court has, with a certain consistency, been against agency decision making. But on stuff like this, although the decision came down differently, it's really they're against this kind of stuff when it's a Democrat.
Totally.
And that is, again, and we saw that to a great degree with the Obamacare Medicaid expansion stuff. We got pretty close to it on the case, the name of which I forget, way back in, guess it was maybe 2015. I don't remember exactly. Maybe it was earlier. The big Obamacare case that John Roberts basically saved, where you just hobble Democratic administrations on what they can do. So anyway,
Right. So that one, and then the one that was a bit less surprising, but basically, Louisiana is trying to fight a lower court order instructing it to redraw its congressional maps because the state so like diluted its black voters that in kind of classic a race dilution case, and that case was put on hold while the Supreme Court was deciding the Alabama one that we talked about, I think last episode, maybe a couple episodes ago. And so the court just kind of rejected Louisiana's old pending emergency appeal to try to not have to redraw its maps, to try to kind of scoot right up to the Supreme Court and get a more favorable decision. So they sent that back down to the lower courts, which is kind of the ripple effect from the big VRA case. And Louisiana is one of the big states that experts pointed to as probably ultimately going to have to draw another Black opportunity district and seat there.
got it.
So that's our lengthy Louisiana Supreme Court corner. So there's a couple other things we wanted to kind of briefly talk about, and one of them is this tape of Trump talking to a group that had come to Mar-a-Lago because some people involved are writing a biography of Mark Meadows. And we knew of the existence of this conversation from the indictment because a lot of it's contained in there. But then CNN obtained the actual recording of Trump talking to these people and like flaunting, an attack plan against Iran. And it's just, in some ways, I found it very kind of vindicating of the way we've been thinking about Trump's holding on to these documents, because it's so like there's one part where he just says like, oh, it's so cool, and isn't it like, can you believe I actually have these? So like bravado-y, which I mean is a word he used to describe it
Yeah,
later.
yeah. There's also a kind of a Gollum-y sort of element to
Yeah.
it, because you kind of imagine that when he's feeling like hurt or scared, he might just like rub the documents, right, to get his power back or something like
Yeah.
that. And the thing that struck me, I mean, if you haven't heard this recording, it's worth just Googling, going to CNN, whatever, and listening, because as Kate said, the gist of it and some of the direct quotes were in the indictment. So we've known about this, but as is so often the case, actually hearing it, just it's not the same to see the transcription. It's quite something. But the thing that really strikes me, and again, I think it's what he's talking about. The reason he brings this up is he is still angry that Milley said at one point, after all the January 6th, last weeks of the administration stuff trying to overturn the election, that he was afraid that Trump was going to try to launch a war against Iran as sort of a distraction to hold on to power, whatever. Okay. So he's still angry about this. And Trump thinks that this vindicates him because there's this war plan. So that Milley brought him. Ergo, I didn't want to start a war. Milley wanted to start a war. Well, first of all, this is an absurd inference or thing to think, because the U.S. government has extensive and detailed war plans for wars against all sorts of countries, not just the obvious ones, even some friendly countries. Everybody. That's just what Pentagons do. That's what general staffs do. You do it because you want to be prepared, but also because you're a general staff. What else are you going to do? Like come up with food recipes? So the point is, the fact that this plan existed is meaningless. It doesn't prove anything. But I think it doesn't he in the actual recording said it kind of proves my case.
Yeah.
That's one of okay. But so the thing is, what case? There's no case. But in his mind, he's still in this battle of wills with Milley about about who wanted to go to war with Iran. And even though his premise is absurd, clearly he thinks that he's holding this over Milley. Kind of like, oh no, I got the secret documents. I got the I got the goods. I'm gonna bring down the hammer on you. And I may or may not. That is what he's holding on to these documents about. And that doesn't exonerate him, because having them means maybe I could show them to the Saudis, or maybe I could do this, or maybe I could do that. We've seen with Trump, there are all those times where he will either do or threaten to do X, and he's not allowed to do X. And he gets asked about it, and he said, oh, I didn't do X. Of course, I'm totally within my rights to do X, and everybody agrees I can do X, and I might do X, but I didn't do X. The same Trump razzmatazz, mind fucking, gaslighting, all that kind of stuff. But you can see it's basically, I could or I couldn't. Be nice to me. I can do what I want. And so these documents are just another thing of that. And again, that's not saying he wouldn't give them to some foreign government. He might, but it's more his ability to. And the people know he still has juice. And you can, in this tape, you can just feel it. Him saying, oh, look at these documents. Aren't they cool? I could, this is the proof. Poor Milley. He hates that I have these, because I could just show him. Oh, it just gives you a feel for it. Just what a feral, ridiculous little man. There's kind of no other way to put it.
It's funny because now it's classic Trump, but like his defenses have already been scattered, but now they're just like so ludicrous. He'll be like, Sean Hannity was the first one who asked him about the recording when its existence kind of became known. And Trump was like, no, I haven't seen it, don't know anything about it. And then, a few phrases later, he's talking about how you can hear the rustle of the paper on the clip. And he's trying to use that as evidence, question mark, that, these are just news articles and photos and whatever. So he can't even, have you heard the clip or have you not, and then he switches into this the bravado quote where he's like, oh, I think I was just kind of like showing off, essentially. These weren't real documents, blah blah blah. But it's just like really shooting from the hip now, because it's one thing to kind of have your game plan be the indictment is bullshit, the indictment is a political witch hunt, everything in it is false. And then you have the audio come out, which both kind of undergirds what was in the indictment and makes it a hell of a lot harder to be like, well, that's just a fabrication by evil Jack Smith,
Right. Well, it's also, because it's important for us to remember that it's not impossible that he just had some blank computer paper or some printouts of Newsmax or something like that he was like rustling around and stuff like that. But it's important to remember that in a trial context, the issue is you had the documents. We asked for the documents. You refused. Then you hid them. Then you said you gave them back when you didn't. Then you hid them again. Then you had your butler move them to the bathroom, all this kind of stuff. And here we have a tape of you're saying, yeah, I have them. I shouldn't have them. They're super classified, but I'm going to show them to you. And in that context, since it all fits together, right? You're like, oh, maybe just this one time he didn't actually have them and he was pretending he had them because he totally didn't have them. It's sort of like preponderance of evidence. Not that preponderance of evidence is the standard, but like it all fits together. And
Right.
So, he's so guilty as sin that it is obviously when you're a president and everybody's got strong feelings about you. Everyone in the country has strong feelings about you. There's not going to be anybody they find to impanel who's like, oh, I never even noticed he was president. It's inevitably kind of different, but it is worth coming back to, in any other universe, the evidence is just so overwhelming. And the weird thing about this tape is that the tape is almost divine. It's almost as if the things he said were calculated to knock down every conceivable defense. Because he says, one of the defenses, they're mine. What are you talking about? These are mine. So what's even going on here? Or I didn't know they were classified. Or they weren't classified because I declassified them in my mind. And all these kind of things. And in the recording, he basically says, super cool. These are super classified. And then he says, too bad. I wish I could declassify them, but I'm not president anymore. I can't do that. And you're just sort of like, check, check, check. Just you're going down the list of defenses, and he's knocking every single one down. It's almost like, in the age of AI, you'd almost wonder, like, did Jack Smith just AI this, right? Because it's so perfect, you almost can't believe it. But
it's like the perpetual tweet of the Trump era, which is always, in response to like Marjorie Taylor Greene or whatever, saying, if they can do this to him, imagine what they'll do to you. And then someone always responds something like, wow, really good point. The next time I do my crimes in public on a recording, I'm really going to think twice,
Exactly.
So, and speaking of MTG, we wanted to kind of end with a little Schadenfreude corner here, which is called the House Freedom Caucus, kind of ripping itself apart. Our readers, I'm sure, are going to remember that, our listeners rather, that last week MTG was caught calling Lauren Boebert a little bitch on the House floor because Boebert had introduced her own articles of impeachment against Biden rather than signing on to MTG's, which we'll all remember, I believe she filed the day after he was inaugurated, maybe day of.
Right.
And that has since seemed to be kind of a backbreaking straw, because on Friday, the House Freedom Caucus took kind of an informal vote about booting Marjorie Taylor Greene from its ranks. And while it seems that vote showed there was enough support to get rid of her, it hasn't yet been acted upon. I think partially because the caucus hasn't booted anyone before, and there's still some contention over that. But basically, it's funny because you see all this and you're like, okay, what are they fighting about? And it's kind of
do
amorphous.
they have even a nominal issue? Like what? I mean, I think here, isn't it that Kevin McCarthy basically appointed Marjorie Greene as his freak warden in the Freedom Caucus to keep those people in line. And she has, I would say, relatively deftly remained totally crazy, but also kind of kept people from putting McCarthy in too big a jam. During the debt ceiling thing, she was kind of like, oh, this is a tough pill to swallow, but we are cutting some big time government back, and I'll have to see, but it would certainly be wrong for anybody to attack Kevin, all this kind of stuff. And even though she was sort of in this, I shouldn't go there, but look, it's just so Real Housewives, right? Like every meme from that show you could just use about this with the ridiculous fighting and the drama and everything. On the surface, she was, and yes, you can send your disappointed emails to talk@talkingpointsmemo.com and say how Josh has let you down. It, like, on the surface, she's saying, oh, you stole my impeachment. But clearly this is also part of McCarthy's desire to, like, dude, can we not impeach Biden? like right now, kind of. So she's still trying to play that freak warden thing. And isn't that, I mean, that seems basically what they're upset about, right?
Yeah, I mean, what they're saying is that they are trying to purge the committee of inactive members and kind of rhino members, House Freedom Caucus and name only
Right,
people.
right,
But
right.
yeah, I mean, it's clear she's taking the brunt because she has taken kind of the Jim Jordan route of crazy to ingratiating yourself with leadership so you can get it like nice committee spots and
Yeah,
stuff like that. Kind of it does pay to be tight with the establishment.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and I think in that position, she is also occasionally like, bad talked the House Freedom people or said they're being unreasonable about various things where they're at odds with McCarthy. And I think, they're time to purge the disloyal member, right?
Well, the thing is too, is just for our listeners, like generally speaking, these, like originally, I remember when they first started the House Freedom Caucus, and they were like secretly meeting in this Tortilla Flats place up on Capitol Hill or something. The point is, it's not like kicking someone off a committee, right? Where that's kind of like, okay, we're going to take away that vote, we're going to take away your committee assignments. They're just kind of clubs, right? It's kind of like if you're in a high school clique of like, the stoners or the D&D nerds, and if the stoners got together, we're going to expel you from the stoners. It just, these things are not so, they're really not so structured that people get expelled. That's just kind of not how it works generally. So I don't think, at least, that it's really like just that they've never expelled someone. Like, people don't expel anyone. I mean, I remember wasn't it didn't Justin Amash, before he like got basically kicked out of Congress, he like left the Freedom Caucus because
Yep.
he was, they were so pro Trump, and good for him. He ended up sacrificed his career over something pretty important, or at least his time in Congress. But yeah, it's just weird. And certainly there are, I think there's a good 40 plus people in there. It's not like she's not like a contender in the craziness department, right? I mean, it's not just Matt Gaetz and like Biggs and whoever else, the kind of the hardcore people who actually like vote against
Hmm.
McCarthy for speaker and stuff. So, but I thought I heard that they're gonna hold like the vote on Friday, or was that just an idea, or is that locked in? Maybe it was
I'm
just
not
a kind of
sure.
a,
Yeah.
I guess we'll see.
Yeah, they're also like not super talking in public about it, so most of what we're getting, is kind of secondhand. But um, I don't know. It's funny because this is such like a resistance lib thing to say, but watching how this has gone, it just really Nancy Pelosi simply does not get the respect that she deserves because I mean, can you imagine like any the kind of dust ups that the House Democrats had were, covered like breathlessly, and there was constant attempts by kind of the Beltway press to craft stories that kind of pitted the reasonable centrists against the shrill, uh, childish progressives who just don't have an understanding of how government works. Like that was were trying to use that framework all the time, and still the reality often just didn't fit into it because Pelosi had like a cracked whip over her caucus, and everyone pretty much acted in lockstep for most of the time. And when there was little moments of kind of like, blah, 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 it was mostly like Josh Gottheimer being like, well, Manchin's getting all the attention and I want some.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, and compared to this shit show, it is night and day.
Yeah, I mean, some of it is just, Democratic Party is a is a different party, or rather, this Republican Party is a different party. I mean, this is a kind of like a level of clown show that you just don't really see anything comparable to in anything, e- even on the, I was going to say recent history, but I mean recent history in the last like century or something like that. But it's also true, and it's interesting. I'm actually I'm reading uh, a book. about cent- centrists versus progressives, in the sense that Pelosi and Biden are centrists, even though I'm not even sure what that means, and how the two sides were able to really kind of basically maintain a united front through the Trump administration and into the Biden administration. It's really interesting stuff. But certainly, I mean, this is why Nancy Pelosi is the best and most successful legislative leader in any of our lifetimes. And when I see any of, I mean, if you're 80, you too, right? That doesn't mean she has the best policies necessarily, or that you have to like her. But being a legislative leader is a certain skill set of managing a legislative party, and some of that's carrots and some of that's sticks, and keeping everybody on side, and just uh, amazingly successful. And we mentioned Obamacare a little earlier in this episode in the context of Supreme Court stuff. But I will never forget that night that God, what was the guy's name? That Republican senator from Massachusetts, Scott. Oh, God, what is his name? The guy who basically ended up replacing Ted Kennedy, whose name escapes me at the moment, and who Elizabeth Warren eventually beat. In any case, that was a special election that took the Democrats from 60 Senate seats to 59, which was critical for the passage of Obamacare. And I will never forget that night. A lot of Democrats just went wobbly, and Barney Frank of all people, put out a statement that night like, "Oh, womp womp womp. I guess we're not going to get Obamacare. Oh, too bad." And I remember thinking, like, dude, what? Like, really? Like, you of all people, like, you are kind of giving up that way. And the next day, I don't think it was a statement. I think it was basically leaked what she said in a House Democratic Caucus meeting the next day. And remember, this is when she's still speaker, first time as speaker. Basically, it's this great line, kind of like, we're going to go through the wall, and if we can't go through the wall, we're going to catapult over the wall, and if we can't catapult over the wall, we're going to dig under the, like, we are going to get this done. No matter what, we are not giving this up. And as a lot of you remember, what ended up happening is the only way to do that was basically the House had to accept the Senate's version, because that was the only, because the Senate had already voted on it, so they had that option. They couldn't get it through the Senate again because they only had 59 seats, and that required Pelosi going to herself, but really almost everybody in the House, saying, yeah, it sucks. We wanted to negotiate this, and we wanted to push it further to more coverage, further to left, whatever you want to put it. But that ship has sailed, and this is what we have to do. And you are all going to do it. And they did do it. And that is why we have Obamacare. Just no one like her, even compared to, like, LBJ, Sam Rayburn types. No one compares. There's no other way to put it.
Also, this is a delayed help, but Scott Brown was the name
Scott
we were
Brown.
looking for before.
Yes, Scott Brown. Well, let's just say a forgettable character, I think is the best way to put it. But yeah. All right. So I guess is that pretty much all we got for this week. Remember, sponsor is TPM. We are coming into the last week of our drive for the TPM Journalism Fund. If you've been thinking about it, if you've been delaying it, try to make, when you hear this podcast, the day you contribute, because we're really pushing to kind of end this with a big success. It's important to the whole organization this year into next year. So TPM Journalism Fund Drive. Either if you hang out at the website, great. just click one of the links. If you don't, if you're just a podcast person, go to talkingpointsmemo.com and, you'll see promos for it. Just click around. And that's it for this
All
week.
right. See you next week.
Later.
The Josh Marshall Podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.